Hello everyone, my name is Kathy Elliott Burnison, and I am here to promote and talk about Orange Shirt Day. The initiatives ask every Canadian to wear an orange shirt on September 30th, in spirits of healing and reconciliation. Orange Shirt Day is on September 30th because that was the time of year that children were taken away from their homes and communities to go to residential schools. What is Orange Shirt Day, you may ask? Orange Shirt Day is a movement that will officially begin in 2013, but in reality it began in 1973 when 6-year-old Phyllis Webstad entered the Joseph Mission Residential School outside of Williams Lake, BC. Young Phyllis lived with her granny on the Dog Creek Reserve. Her granny bought her a brand new shirt for her first day of school, but the mission oblates quickly stripped her of her new shirt and replaced it with a school uniform. Phyllis Webstad's truth, the inspiration for Orange Shirt Day. I went to the mission from 1973 to 1974. I had just turned 6 years old. I lived with my grandmother on the Dog Creek Reserve. We never had very much money, and there was no welfare. But somehow, my granny managed to buy me a new outfit to go to the mission school. I remember going to the Burnison store and picking out a shiny orange shirt. It had string lace up in the front of it, and it was so bright and exciting, just like I felt to be going to school. When I got to the mission, they stripped me and took away my clothes, including the orange shirt. I never saw it again. I didn't understand why they wouldn't give it back to me. It was mine. The orange shirt has always reminded me of that, and how my feelings didn't matter, how no one cared, how I felt like I was nothing. All of us little children were crying and no one cared. I was 13 years old and in grade 8 when my son Jeremy was born. Because my grandmother and my mother both attended residential school for 10 years each, I never knew what a parent was supposed to be like. I went to a treatment center for healing when I was 27 years old, and I have been on this healing journey since then. I finally get it. The feeling of worthlessness and significance ingrained in me from my first day at missions affected the way I lived my life for many years, even now, when I know nothing could be further than the truth. I still sometimes feel that I don't matter, even with all the work I have done. I am honored to be able to tell my story so that others may benefit and understand. And maybe other survivors will feel comfortable enough to share their stories. I'm going to talk a little bit about residential schools. The residential schools were located off of reserve, attended by children for the 10-month academic year. Some children would live at the residential school for year-round. Students were taught to do physical labor such as cleaning, cooking, sewing, and farm work to maintain the schools. They spent a few hours in the classroom. Students lived in a low-quality condition and endured physical, emotional, and sometimes sexual abuse. They rarely had the opportunity to see examples of normal family life. Residential schools were funded by the Canadian government and run by the Roman Catholic churches and about 12 United churches. There were a total of 139 schools in every province and territory, except for Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. It is estimated 150,000 and counting children were removed from their communities and forced to attend residential schools. Although there was no school in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, the Mi'kmaq and Musqueam children attended the Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia Indian Residential School. This school was run by the Catholic Church. It opened in 1929 and closed in June of 1967. Why were these residential schools created? In the 17th century, the Canadian government believed it was responsible for education and caring for Indigenous people in Canada. They believed the best way to make them successful was to have them learn English and adopt Christianity and Canadian customs. Ideally, they would pass their adopted lifestyle on to their children, and native traditions and languages would be completely abolished in a few generations. It was believed that Indigenous culture would be unable to adapt to a rapidly modernizing society, and so to be successful, Indigenous people would have to be assimilated into mainstream Canadian society by praying and speaking like other Canadians. The government at the time developed a policy called aggressive assimilation to be taught at a church-run and government-funded schools called residential schools. The government felt that children were easier to mold than adults, and taking them away from their families was the best way to prepare them for life in mainstream society. Are there any residential school survivors still living? In 2011, there were 80,000 people living who had survived the residential school experience. How many children did not survive? In 2015, it was believed that 6,000 children died while attending residential schools. There could be many more as there are unmarked graves. Every residential school had a graveyard adjacent to it. Truth and Reconciliation Commission report estimates the number of unmarked graves to be 3,200. Effects of attending residential schools. The aims of assimilation meant devastation for those who were subject to years of abuse, loss of traditional languages, loss of culture and traditional knowledge, disconnected from family and community. When students returned to the reserve, they often found themselves they didn't belong. They didn't know the skills to help their parents and became ashamed of their native heritage. Intergenerational trauma, where the trauma of residential schools continues to be felt by families for many generations. Effects on mental and emotional well-being includes mental distress, depression, addictive behaviors, and substance misuse, stress, and suicide behavior. What does reconciliation mean to Canada? In Canada, the process of reconciliation is tied to the federal government's relationship with Indigenous people. The term has come to describe attempts, individual and institutional, to raise awareness about colonization and its ongoing effects on Indigenous people. What does reconciliation mean to Indigenous people? Provide support towards effects to improve and enhance relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. To recognize and celebrate the strengths, courage, resiliency, and achievements of residential school survivors and all Indigenous people. To contribute to a sense of identity, unity, and belonging. To promote Indigenous language, cultures, traditional and spiritual values. Remember in a tangible and permanent way the residential school experience. Want to do more than wear an orange shirt on September 30th? Raise awareness and start a conversation about the orange shirt. by talking about the history of residential schools and reconciliation. Watch a virtual event online with your children, your family, or your spouse. Share Phyllis Webstad's Orange Shirt Days presentation. Her presentation is based off of her orange shirts being removed and replaced with a school uniform.
Hello everyone, my name is Phyllis Webstad. I am Shawetm from the Strachamch, Kenno Creek, Chatlam, Dog Creek First Nation, which is about 1.5 hours southwest from Williams Lake, BC. I grew up with my granny on the Dog Creek Reserve until I was 10, then moved with my auntie after she finished university. When I had just turned 6, I was sent to the St. Joseph Indian Residential School near Williams Lake, a place we called the Mission. My granny bought me a shiny new orange shirt to go to school in. When I got there, I was stripped, my clothing taken away, including my new orange shirt, and I never saw it again. I was no longer excited to be going to school. I wanted to go home to Granny. I had to stay there for 300 sleeps. No matter how much all of us little kids cried, it didn't matter. No one listened to us. Our feelings didn't matter. We didn't matter. I am the 3rd generation that attended residential school. Both my grandmother and mother attended the Mission for 10 years each.
Read Phyllis' story. It's a good book to read. I read it to my children and they got to learn about her story and residential schools. Those are some things that you can do, and you can also donate to the Orange Shirt Society. The Orange Shirt Society was formed in Williams Lake by the funders of Orange Shirt Day to encourage and support communities to recognize Orange Shirt Day and to support reconciliation.